Thank you so much, and I really appreciate everybody's attendance here today. And just about last night, you can't get a show like that at JP Morgan, I'm just saying. If you attended the extravaganza, that was really special. So let's jump into it right away. If my panelists would each introduce themselves, and that will help with their perspective as we share our thoughts.
Yeah. Ashley Seehusen, Santé Ventures. I'm a venture partner there. Santé is an early stage life science investment company. We invest in health tech, med tech, and biotech.
I'm David Zakariaie. I'm the CEO and founder of Senseye. At Senseye, we're building the first diagnostics and severity monitoring platform for behavioral health, and our initial focus is on PTSD, anxiety, and depression.
I'm Bill Hunter. I'm the CEO of Canary Medical. We put sensing implants inside other medical devices to connect them to the internet. Our lead product is the Persona IQ Smart Knee made by Zimmer Bauman.
I'm Shobha Parthasarathi. I'm an advisor with Xontogeny, which is a Boston-based life sciences accelerator, and we're associated with a venture fund and a hedge fund. The venture fund is called Perceptive Xontogeny Venture Fund, and we invest in pretty much everything, seed and Series A, B stage companies, developing either therapeutics, diagnostics, medical devices, research tools, and digital health as well, except not just pure software.
Great. So since this is a digital focus, we had to pick a small sector. And the sector I think that we could have the most impact on is the management of chronic disease. We may fray out on that a little bit, but I really want to focus on that today because I think that's where digital really has its best opportunity to enter in an actionable way to medtech. For those of us that have been involved in digital companies to date, they're fantastic sounding, but nobody's really figured out how to get paid for them yet. We've introduced them in the last couple of years, and a large majority of them have not figured out who's going to pay that bill. Therefore, the adoption is tough. But when we think about chronic disease, 18% of our GDP is spent on that, managing that in this country, and 80% of that 18% is the management of chronic disease. So as we look at this, that patient and consumer monitoring comes to mind. Yet, what I want to discuss tonight or today is who's going to own that ultimately? The convergence of the data, the consumer, patient, and they're two different things. The pharmaceutical company, the biotech company, or the device company, because it's up for grabs right now. And is it going to fall under the control of one of those entities? Or is there going to be a new agency that will be developed that will hold that data, that will have the trust of the consumer, that will give full access and be able to make that actionable data? I want to open up with a quote that Bill had to get us started. Bill wrote an article, "After a little over a decade of participating in the field of digital health, I've reached the conclusion that successful companies follow a predictable pathway based upon the growing number of patients they have under management. Digital health companies begin as patient monitoring companies, become diagnostic companies, and evolve into patient management companies." Bill, I don't know when you wrote that, but do you still believe that to be true?
Yeah, I do. I think you start collecting data and you're not always sure what it means. And the first thing you can do with that data is patient monitoring. And then people say, that's great, but who cares? What are you going to do with it that's clinically meaningful? And so the next thing you do is try to do predictive analytics to figure out what it means and try and get out in front of whatever it is that you're monitoring. And then you do that, and people say, that's great, but how do I change patient outcomes? And then you have to evolve into using that data to manage the patient and actually change, whatever parameter it is you're looking at. And you kind of go through that evolution because at the end of the day, you get paid for outcomes, and data is not outcomes. It's applied data that's outcomes, and that's kind of the route you go through to get there.
Are we getting paid for outcomes, or are we still a fee-for-service environment in healthcare? Ash?
I think we're somewhere in the middle. I feel like we are evolving as we get more devices that are connected and we have more data. We're figuring out what to do with it. Some of it is pay for our service. Again, we're trying out some of those models. I think we're trying out some of the models where we just give patients unlimited data. I mean, a lot of us have this. I have lots of functionality on this. It tells me the time, and that's about it. So, data is only important to the person it matters to, who can interpret it and is willing to pay for it. And I think that is the biggest thing, is willing to pay for it.
Shobha, so this massive data, Bill had shared a stat when we were just waiting. Bill, what was the number you had to date right now with your implant?
We have about 1 billion data points, and we now have a millennium of post-operative patient data.
Yeah, that's a substantial number. Yet, who is going to own that, get actionable information out of it? And does that need to be an agency at large, or will it be owned by big pharma or big device?
It really depends on the utility of that data, right? Who's going to use that data and for what purpose? So sitting where I sit, which is early stage startups, right, that we invest in. So it's really two different worlds right now that we live in. So you've got the traditional, the pharma, the medical device companies, and the data science companies. And then you've got the biotechs. What's really impressive to see is that the new biotechs that are coming out, it doesn't matter whether it's therapeutic, diagnostic, they are much more integrated right from the start in their thinking. As they're developing the therapeutic, they're thinking about what's the device they're going to use to deliver. They're thinking about what data they're going to integrate into their regulatory pathway, what they need from the FDA purposes, who's going to pay. I mean, they are thinking it in a much more wholesome way than we did in the past, which is very product-driven, right? Now, I think everybody's aware that the patient is really a customer, a very engaged customer. The patient is no longer at the receiving end of the treatment, but wants to actively be engaged in their treatment, actively monitor themselves, be monitored on the other side as well. And that whole thing is, I think, changing the way things are developed, things are monitored. And I think big pharma, big medical device companies are doing it more sort of retroactively. They're looking at the data after having brought the product out, whereas these guys, which is the space that I live in, I see them kind of all happening in parallel. Mm-hmm. So who's going to own it? To me, it all depends on, a lot of these AI companies are taking data from public sources, generating their own, combining it all. Ownership, I think, is still up for grabs.
All right, but data from the public is public data. Personal healthcare data is highly protected.
Correct.
Right? And so, David, I want to jump to you because people generally don't put mental health in chronic healthcare. We usually use heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, pain management, but mental health sits in one of the largest categories in chronic healthcare.
Yeah, it does. And so I think it's interesting because the way that we think about the issues of the mental health industry today and kind of what we're trying to do, we think like the large reason why mental health can become a chronic issue is that we don't have diagnostics and we don't have really any way of monitoring and managing a patient other than basically asking them, some sort of qualitative question every day. And most people know, like, if you ask, most people don't want to tell a random clinician how they're actually doing and feeling, and so that just doesn't really work. And so the way we're kind of thinking about it, the most interesting statistic I ever learned, for a lot of traditionally chronic mental health conditions, the largest of which is PTSD. The difference between PTSD being something chronic that a patient is stuck with for the rest of their lives, and something that can effectively be treated in about 16 weeks of evidence-based psychotherapy, is if you diagnose it within 2 years of the traumatic event occurring, and if you are able to actually do the right modality of psychotherapy. And so that's a situation where being able to diagnose accurately, but also being able to monitor the patient and the severity of the patient to ensure the treatment they're receiving is, that will make a very large impact on the quality of life of that patient for the rest of their lives. And so, in our situation, we own a lot of the data because there aren't really public sets of data for what we're doing. It's all kind of being generated on our own studies. But exactly what we're able to do with a lot of that data, I think is still kind of an open-ended question.
So I want to start at the top here with who's going to own this data. Can it be a pharmaceutical company? And pharmaceutical companies have owned some of the largest class action lawsuits this country's ever seen. So is there trust there for the data? Bill, you're giggling. Device is an episodic moment in time of care. So they really haven't managed the lifetime customer. Pharmaceutical has, though. In vitro diagnostic companies, possibility. Or is there an entity? And you've got to pick one of the doors here. Or is there an entity that yet has been established that is either government-owned or independent, like our credit card company, who they get us, we trust them. They deal with the merchant, they deal with the bank. And all they are is sitting in the middle protecting your data, and you trust them. American Express, Visa, MasterCard, Diners Club, whatever it is.
I think you just touched on something really important, is the data should belong to the patient, right? It's their condition, their thing to manage, and having a say in who and how they sell, give, manage that data is going to be really important. I think patients aren't brought up enough in this and thinking really about their ownership. A lot of companies are benefiting off their data, and granted, the individual dollars associated with that are pretty small, but really thinking about where does the patient fit in and how do we advocate for them to own their own data within this larger structure. And you're right, like maybe there is a place to bank it, or a company that manages more data. And again, I see a lot of really early startups that have some great wearable, they're collecting a lot of great information, but then when their business plan starts to fall apart, is what do they do with that information? Physicians are bombarded with information and data, and really being able to do something actionable and using that in a productive way doesn't always happen. And I'd say with companies that you have a service, et cetera, like sure, there's more there. And then there's giving it to the patient themselves and letting them decide, are you giving them anything actionable, or are you just telling them, hey, this is happening? And so I think we need to think through all of those things and putting the patient really at the center of it.
Bill, your thoughts on that? Before you answer, so I take a DNA test, I take a 23andMe test, I see what I'm predisposed for. I then have some monitoring going on me. I'm a consumer. I'm not even chronic disease state, even though 60% of the population has one of the chronic diseases. And I monitor that data with control limits, but all of a sudden I start to infringe upon the control limits, what I'm predisposed for. Subclinical signs come up. Who manages that as we move forward with all these consumer-driven devices and also those that the device companies are making?
Yeah, I'd never really thought about what you said until you said it. I'd never thought about some separate entity being responsible for that. I started my career as a doc, and so my belief is exactly the same. The patient owns the data. I believe that philosophically and legally. The reality, though, is that you press one click on your acceptance, and now that data's into the ether. And so the patient doesn't tend to be a very good custodian of that data. So the concept of having a centralized custodian is actually an intriguing idea, and not one that I've ever thought of. I know from a practical point of view, in the real world, everybody seems to think they own the data. The hospital owns the data, the doctor owns the data, the payer owns the data, and we could waste the rest of our panel talking about the legal wranglings in between all of those. So I don't think there is an answer. I think there's a philosophical answer. I don't think there's a practical answer.
And Shobha, your response. So I think I've counted 147 patient monitoring companies that are in process right now. Sort of as sublime as many robotic companies. There's only going to be a couple when the dust settles. And so with those, they're building the proximity to the patient, but that's probably the most and least important part of the proposition. So where are we going with these small little islands of data and nobody's aggregating them to put actionable information together. And venture capital loves SaaS, loves subscription prescription models. And you guys have to have your eyes on that.
True. I mean, going from small to big scale, I mean, if the individual just holds on to the data, it's really of no use to society as a whole, right? The data actually becomes useful when it's looked at it in a global sense, right? Whether it's for patient segregation, for patient, for clinical trials, right? All of that for grouping of patients, you need to have one large entity that can access that data. So at the individual level, yes, it's mine, but then it doesn't serve anybody else but just me. So that's a philosophical thing, right? Do I want to be paid for releasing my data? Probably not. But people can hold on to it. So yes, there's these islands of data. And as VCs, I guess we don't think beyond that, right? We are just looking at that one investment and the data that comes out of that, but we're not looking at a more continuity to that. So I have to kind of think, you're right. I mean, you need like an Amazon, right? A one-stop shop for all. That would be ideal, but I don't know if it's practical.
Well, practicality is one thing in today's model, perhaps, but we've got, misaligned incentives across the entire healthcare continuum.
Yes.
Right? But we do have organizations like the IRS that have more data on us than anybody else. We have credit card companies who can predict exactly what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Yet we have not formed an organization like that for the management of our healthcare, which is the single highest expenditure that is crippling this country. So David, in your business model, is the data just go between the patient and the doc? And then is there a higher responsibility to find a lake to put that in, to learn from and to make actionable?
Yeah, it's a good question. In terms of is there a higher responsibility, I think the answer is yes, but that's not somewhere that we're at yet. As the way the product works right now, and it's primarily deployed in clinical trials until we secure a regulatory approval. The data is owned by the patient. A fully anonymized version of it is always saved on our server, which we're using for kind of the continuous training of the model, because we don't need anything identifiable for that. And the actual diagnosis, the severity, and kind of the full report that we generate is saved in the patient's electronic healthcare record. So as far as our product is concerned, the data is I guess effectively owned by whoever owns the rest of their healthcare data. Where else it could be saved, I don't know. I think the idea of a Visa, MasterCard or something is interesting, but I don't know how that, unless it's the government, how that entity gets set up without then using that data for some other commercial purpose. Even your credit card company that knows everything you're going to spend sells advertisers to then target you 20% off whatever because they know you're going to go shop at that place, hopefully. So how we avoid that from happening, I'm not sure unless the government opens the entity. But for us and where we're at, as a startup, this is not an area that we can really innovate in. It's just more of we have to save it in the EHR because if not, we won't get paid.
But this is a device-centric meeting, and there's all device-centric people here. Are we just going to be settling in on saying, fine, we'll make the device for you to track whatever it is, whether you're a consumer or a patient with chronic health issues, but somebody else will worry about how that actually adds value? Because otherwise, remote patient monitoring never gets to really have an impact. Certainly pharmaceuticals making a run on it. Roche website reads, doing now what patients need next. Eli Lilly's website is moving away from pure pharmaceutical, broadening our impact. Our team develops life-changing medicines, but we don't stop there. We're continuing in pursuit of something larger. And so I think that pharma is hinting towards that. And is device going to bungle away the opportunity to have that massive market? where that actually becomes a therapeutic unlock. If you can subclinically find signals that can impact a catastrophic event as you enter that chronic care disease state, that is probably the largest market we've all ever seen while we chase stents and structural heart. So Bill, thoughts in that area?
I think that's true. I think prediction is the key. When you started with the preamble, once you have the data, people say, well, that's great, but giving me the data after the fact is not as meaningful clinically as giving me, an inclination ahead of time, right? A few days' notice on an evolving infection can be the difference between a catastrophic redo and a course of antibiotics, right? There's all kinds of situations where, early intervention makes all the difference in the world. Kind of tying the themes together, I don't think big pharma or big med tech will be aggregators of data. I don't think they're set up to do that. Remember when the internet was being, we were laying fiber all over the world, and they said the last mile was the most expensive into the home, right? We're not set up for the last mile. We're not set up to go into each and every home. That's the domain of the hospitals. That's the domain of the payers and the like. So I think the vision that you're talking about will involve companies doing what you say, which is getting enough data on their own expertise, on their own molecules, their own devices, whatever the case may be, to provide predictive analytics. But ultimately, we will be data providers, we'll be integrators. We'll put that into a bigger system, whether that's in the hospital or whether that's, in the payer, where that is then further refined and mushed together to provide the greater insights beyond that, right? I think a lot of big companies went in thinking they were going to be aggregators, and I don't think that's going to be a reality. I don't think any company's big enough to have that kind of scope, and it's going to happen at the provider level.
That exists today. And again, that's the challenge that I have with this panel here is we reflexively go back to that doesn't exist today.
Yep.
And we've got to look beyond that with our ability to gather this data, converge this data, and make it actionable. Shobha, you're deep in thought down there. Tell me what you're thinking.
You have to separate product from data.
Now, I think of it as a continuum, right? Screening of patients, discovery, then the treatment of patient, the follow-up of patient, and then monitoring of patients, irrespective of the setting, whether it's in a hospital care setting, acute care, home, chronic care, it doesn't matter. They're all interconnected. And for me, I see it as digital coming into play, then device coming into play, then the drug coming into play, the monitoring coming into play. They're just interplaying with each other at different points in the journey of that patient. The thing is, right now, we're all siloed in our thinking. It's not integrated. And that entire journey, end-to-end, needs to be integrated, right? You just have a menu list. Okay, patient A comes. This is the patient A's background. And then how you connect, blah, 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 all of that, right? Back to the patient. So I think the piece that's missing is the linking and the integrating of these individual things. But otherwise, we're all still, that's because we're still thinking in silos.
Yeah. And Ashley, medicine hasn't changed much. About 90% of it's still analog by nature, right? We haven't even really, the stat that Bill gave earlier is in scope. Do you see an environment where pharma device, biotech, gather data, and then again it goes up to another entity, and that provides advisement to a care decider? And I purposefully didn't use the word doctor there, right? So if I've got that 23andMe test, I've got my genetic predisposition, I've got a terrible lifestyle, my sleep habits are terrible. I am talking about me. And,
Me too.
and now the care deliver person or entity says this device with this drug and that pharmaceutical or biotech cocktail, that's what we should be using. And we become more precisely prescriptive with this data lake that we could mine.
Yeah, definitely. I think integration is the key, right? For certain chronic conditions like diabetes, et cetera, sure, that your pharma company could own that and effectively manage it. But when you kind of go beyond that and you look at whole person health it's going to be a higher entity. I think it has to be. And some of the most exciting wearables I've seen are those that have some tech, but then have really thought through the back-end systems. That's the stuff that's getting me excited. How do you plug other things in? How do you make this actually useful in managing your COPD, et cetera? So I do think there'll be a higher entity. I'm not sure it can be one specific pharma company, medical device company, et cetera. But if they can feed into that, if we can integrate, we can start thinking about whole person health. And as you say, identify, you would benefit from this treatment. And, because a medical device company has given you information, they might also get customers from you as well with those alarms, those kind of decision points that happen.
Yep. Bill, you mentioned the last mile. The last mile does exist. So you were talking about fiber. The challenge there was actual physicality of fiber. But nearly every person who walks the earth today has at least one mobile device.
Yes.
So that solves the last mile.
Yep.
From that connectivity side.
Yep.
But David, your product especially, it's critical, that last mile. And it's by the choice of the consumer typically, isn't it? Or the patient, not prescribed to them by the doctor. Is yours a proactive approach? So therefore, is it a consumer seeking help? Or is it somebody who's got it prescribed by a clinician?
So it's both long term, but in the short term, it's the latter first. So because there's no mental health diagnostics out there today, the first iteration of what we're building is a Class 2 medical device. So it has to be prescribed by the clinician. It's a lot, it's a much easier thing to diagnose and process to go through than the way things are done today, but it does still require a clinician in the loop. The way we've defined a clinician is kind of a nurse practitioner up, so it's not just the doctor, but it does require a clinician. In terms of the last mile aspect, though, because what we've built is software, a large part of our strategy is, it's not to build it as a standalone, but to build it as a software development kit and to essentially directly integrate it into as many of the telehealth platforms as we possibly can. And so while it is possible to have the product be used in a physical setting, I think to us it makes a lot of sense to kind of administer it in that, in a much more efficient and scalable manner, which for us is through all the telehealth platforms.
Bill, you and I were discussing some MEMS technology earlier, where that proactively is going to start getting embedded into devices, even from imaging modalities. Where do you see that accelerating to on the data side? And how does it potentially become an unlock for device players and pharma players as well?
Well, when I first started the company, which was 11 years ago, we talked about putting sensors inside medical devices. Most people said, why? And I don't need that. But, the world has changed so much in the last decade, and we live in a world where everything is connected. When your refrigerator's connected to the internet, it's pretty hard to believe that life-saving devices aren't going to be connected. So I think the first step is connectivity. We put an amazing amount of hardware into human beings, and then we walk them to the front door of the hospital and say, best of luck, come see me in 2 weeks. And they have no indication of what's going on. So I think connectivity is number one. I think what we're seeing just in the evolution, not in medicine, but your phone knows where it is on the planet, it knows where it is in 3 space, it can do all kinds of different things. That same technology should be SOP for, life-saving devices. So I think we'll go connectivity, and then we'll go diagnostics, the device providing some sort of feedback, right? Right now, we put things in, and then the only thing we can do is go back and do an MRI or an X-ray or something to figure out what's going on. It would be nice to have from the source data. So I wouldn't be surprised if we had this same panel, 5 or 10 years from now, that almost every device provided some sort of feedback of of all kinds of different natures.
Wouldn't device be motivated to do that because they then go from that episodic point of care into a sort of subscription model of the ongoing monitor of that implant? And what's been the holdup there? Because the technology does exist in mining and all kinds of technology bases other than medtech.
I'll give you a quick answer on both sides, right? I mean, on the first side, on the negative side, there are companies that don't want to know how their device functions. They don't want to know what their failure rates are. I won't single one particular group out, but if they find out that their failure rate is X and their competitors haven't done the same studies, they're worried that that will work against them, right? On the other hand, I think everybody recognizes that being connected has a benefit. Medical devices traditionally have been a single sale entity. So we make total knees. That's a 20-year patient commitment, but historically Zimmer's been paid on day one for doing that, but they had a relationship with the patient for 20 years. It might be better to make less over 20 years than to make the entire payment on day one. And plus, the payers are saying, prove to me that you're giving me 20 years of value that you're asking me to pay for on day one. So I think, in terms of that, using that as a way to extend the payment model or change the payment model, I think that's real, and I think they all recognize that that's where it's going.
And thanks for calling out is what my outcomes were in a clinical trial are often entirely different than when you take a true distribution across the human race. Mm-hmm. So tell me why the argument keeps coming up about shared data and we can't figure it out because of the protection of EHR. Who is standing that up, and why are they standing that up? And we can't possibly get around that. Who is the entity that benefits by keeping that farcical argument on the table? Shobha?
I'm not quite sure I understand what exactly you're trying to get at.
Well, we keep coming back to it's the patient's record, it's the consumer's record, and we've got to protect that. Therefore, we can't share it.
You're talking about individual companies saying that? The ones who have access to patient data?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's walls all around that statement that don't allow us to share this data for the greater being of the patients and the consumer. So who's benefiting by that being in place? And take the patient out, because there's an easy way to anonymize that and bring that to a sort of constructive convergence of helping make better decisions in healthcare.
I think if we get around, it's value, right? It's if you could talk money and you could talk security of that data, right? So as long as we can balance those two out, because that patient data has value, monetary value, and so as long as you can come up with a resolution on how to deal with that monetary piece of it, because sometimes that's the only value there is, right? And so it has to be monetized, which is why people hold on to it. And as far as security, if you can get more confidence that it would be secure, which is not right now, that's not the case. It is being shared and it is being breached, so which is another reason why we hold on to it. So if we can get past that, we might be in a better place.
But your Social Security number is breached. Your credit cards are breached. I have to turn mine in every month. So I just always am poking at that argument. Bill?
I think the real problem we touched on a little earlier is that every board of directors sits down and says, our data is really valuable. And you say, but I don't know how. So since I don't know how it's going to be valuable, and I can't predict how it's going to be valuable in the future, we have to hold on to it. And that's the approach that everybody takes. We have to do a lot of hospital contracts. And it can take us a year to negotiate the data transfer and privacy in those hospital contracts. Why? Because the hospitals know that their aggregated data is going to have real value at some point, and they don't want to give that away. But they don't really know how or why or when. And so I think it comes to we're still at an early stage, and everybody's paranoid that they're going to give away the goose that laid the golden egg, but they don't really know where the assets are and which one's going to be the winner. And so everybody's hanging on to everything, and it's clogging the whole system. And it's happening at multiple levels. It's not just at the company level or the patient level. It's actually not happening at the patient level. It's happening at the hospital level, the payer level, government level, just about everywhere.
David, your thoughts on that?
I don't think I can come up with a more refined answer than Bill. I do think that's what's going on, but I think the other, I don't know. I think the other side of it, the only other reason why I could think that at a board or a corporate level, folks wouldn't want to do it is, in lack of clear regulations in terms of what we're allowed to do with that data. I think there's a lot of liability issues that people just don't want to take, and so I think it's kind of perceived as unnecessary risk, especially in the world we live in today, where the FTC will come after you 5, 10, 15 years after some sort of transaction is already closed. And so, I think it's somewhere between the combination of those two things, but I'm not, I don't really know who's winning. I think it's just clear who's losing.
Ashley, as an investor, how do you look at this?
I think that it's actually the hospitals that are holding on to this isn't an investor take, this is just an industry take I think it's the hospitals that are holding on to that data. EHRs are notoriously messy. If you started mining that for mistakes and complications, I think you'd find all sorts of stuff. And so I
Isn't
think
EHR just a way to bill, though? Not really.
it is.
Yeah.
It is.
That's why it was created.
True. You're absolutely right on that. But there's still, you can see how a patient was treated, what drugs they were given, what device they had, what their follow-up care was, whether they went to PT or not. And it would be a rich database for a lot of the things that are going wrong in healthcare today, and how can we make those things better? And we know that putting a better eye on some of those things actually helps outcomes for patients. I think hospitals are terrified.
Okay, closing question. We'll start from this side with you, Ashley. Who is eventually going to own the broken down silos of data on patient monitoring, personal monitoring, consumer monitoring? Is it one of the device pharma biotech companies or not? Or is it an entity, or is it the government?
I think it's a third-party entity. I don't know if it's the government or not. I feel like a lot of us would have a hard time handing over our data to the government to manage, but it could be, and it might be. It might happen in countries where there's less personal choice to start with, and it might work well, and we'll see where it goes from there. I think in the interim, it might be big pharma, med device to some degree, but ultimately it's going to have to filter up somewhere else.
David?
I think in the short term, in the next 5, 10 years, it's going to be the device companies. At some point, there'll be enough of a critical mass where we'll want to aggregate all that data that some sort of third-party entity will form. I also don't think it's the government, just because it's the government. But I do think a third-party private entity will form for that aggregation.
Bill?
If the patient owns the data, he who owns the patient wins. And so I think it will be different in different parts of the world. So I practiced in socialized medicine, so it will be the government in socialized medicine countries. In the US, it's going to be the payers, because ultimately the payers own the patient.
Shobha?
I think we're following the tech industry in so many ways, right? Whether it's miniaturization, personalization, integration. Think about the big companies today, the tech companies that hold all the data. Same thing could happen to healthcare too, healthcare data.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank my panel. I'd like to thank all that participated in listening to the session. Hope you appreciate it. And thank you for supporting LSI for sure. Thank you.